Well, as promised, I have an interview for you today. My name is Brittany Page. This is the Page Perspective. I announced that I have returned with my previous video from this week about the clearing of a homeless encampment in Washington, D.C., and in the broader context of a trend that is happening of clearing homeless encampments. So if you missed that, if the algorithm didn't feed it to you, then you can go and find it. But today we have an interview with one of my favorite human beings. I think he will be one of your favorite human beings if you finish the conversation and if you follow him. His name is Dr. Chris Hoff, and I want to read his bio just to introduce you to him now. So Dr. Chris Hoff, PhD, LMFT, licensed marriage and family therapist, is based in Orange County, California, and currently serves as the director of the California Family Institute. The California Family Institute provides a low-cost / no-cost counseling to the community and serves as a research and training site for relational therapists interested in innovative therapy practice. Chris also hosts the popular podcast and YouTube channel, The Radical Therapist. Chris is currently the co-editor of the forthcoming Encyclopedia of Radical Helping that will be released by Thick Press in 2024. So Dr. Chris Hoff, the Radical Therapist, is where you can find him online. During this conversation, we talk about where he got that name, some of his work as a therapist and also a supervisor at a low-cost, no-cost clinic in Orange County, and some of the critiques that we have about the field of psychology right now and online therapists and apps like BetterHelp. So it's a lot of fun, this conversation. I think it's informative. I hope you get a lot out of it, and I look forward to hearing feedback from you. But now it's time to get to it. So let's hear from Dr. Chris Hoff. All right, welcome, Dr. Chris Hoff. How are you doing today?
Hi, Brittany. Good to see you. I've missed you.
I have missed you too. I'm so happy that you're here. You're one of my favorite human beings, so I'm very excited for the YouTube audience to be introduced to you. And I want to start with you. You host a podcast, you host the YouTube channel, The Radical Therapist, and I'm wondering where you got that name and I guess why the idea of being a radical therapist appeals to you.
Yeah, okay. Thanks for the question, and thanks for having me on. Um, you know, you were instrumental in the Radical Therapist podcast and YouTube channel coming around, and Jesse, of course, too. And Jesse had suggested to me early on. I think it's been about 6 years now that I've been doing the podcast.
Wow.
That I should have a podcast, and once I got bought into the idea and started to go about doing something about it, I remembered I thought to myself, well, I have the perfect title for it. It's The Radical Therapist, and I was in a used bookshop, a year or two before the podcast idea came around, and I found this compilation, this book called The Radical Therapist, which was a compilation of um, this breakoff group from the American Psychiatry Association that had started this journal called The Radical Therapist in the late 60s, early 70s. And it was a kind of a compilation of some of the articles from their journal. And I was just kind of fascinated by it. It was kind of that early radical psychiatry movement. And they were very interested in interrogating their own practices, so to speak. And so I thought it would be a perfect title because I am kind of contrarian by nature, and I am interested in examining the practices in the mental health field and not just taking them for granted. And so I thought it would be a good fit for the podcast and the YouTube channel. So that's kind of how that came about.
What would you say are some of the issues today that you feel like within the field that you have contrarian views toward some things? Like, what are some of those contrarian views?
Oh, wow. So, well, if you go to my YouTube channel, you can see a lot of my, a lot of my takes on certain kind of developments in the field currently. I think predominantly now some of the things that we're probably going to talk about is, around how do we, what's going to happen with, the social media and therapy, Instagram therapy, TikTok therapy, what's happening with that, kind of the tech that's moving into the mental health field. There's a big movement in, Silicon Valley or venture capital moving into mental health apps and that kind of thing. And that's problematic in my mind. Could create a lot of problems. It could be helpful in some cases, but I could see a lot of downside to that too. And of course, the continued diagnostic culture that we have currently about, and the way that the psychiatry language is being used in all contexts of our world now, and how it's bleeding into a lot of different contexts in problematic ways. So I think some of those things are at the forefront of kind of what I'm thinking about now. And quite honestly, thinking about, how can therapy be more effective, right? Because we haven't moved the needle a lot in the therapy world and outcomes and effectiveness. And the research is pretty clear on that. And a lot of folks there was a wonderful article written by Scott Miller around how psychotherapy has lost its magic with a K. And he showed the stats that a lot of people are moving to seeing psychics and healers of all kinds and tarot card readers, and people going to see therapists are going down. And I have some opinions about why that's happening, but I think that it is happening. And
Mhm.
I think that's problematic for our field.
Yeah. I wonder how much of that you feel is also due to a lack of, like, good public policy in this country. One of my guiding principles is that mental health is political, and by that, I
Mm-hmm.
mean many of the solutions to the mental health crises that we see right now are due in part to, like, a lack of affordable housing, a lack of paid time off, paid sick leave, funding education, childcare, all of these things that would really help people be able to manage mental health crisis or mental health issues when they come up. And it's not that I'm saying that there's, no place for psychiatric care. Obviously, there is. I wouldn't have become a therapist if I didn't believe in the power of therapy. But I also think that, we can only do so much when we have so much lacking in this country. So, I mean, given your work in running a clinic, a sliding scale clinic where you help low
Mm-hmm.
income people, how do
Mm-hmm.
you see the issue of policy and politics kind of mingling with therapy work?
Well, I think it's everything, and I think that's one of the things that's problematic about, like, the therapy speak in the world, right? A lot of that has a tendency to privatize mental health issues, and what I mean by that, or just pathologize, privatize mental health issues, and it kind of locates the problem in the individual. And I think it's 2023. I think we can all agree now that many problems that are created in people's lives are because of the larger social cultural context, right? All the things that you describe: housing, just food security, economic status, all of this stuff, creates. I believe, that's the way that I situate myself in the work. Is that all of that stuff, the policy, is by and large creating a lot of what gets called mental health problems. Is
Mhm.
creating those problems in people's lives, right? And so, yeah, I am absolutely a political therapist. I don't think there's any way not to be. I think I did a video on my YouTube channel called "The Myth of Neutrality." Where I watched, I saw this couples therapist saying, "I'm going to be a neutral person in your relationship," and I thought, at best that's naive, and at worst that's dangerous, because there is no neutrality in the work that we do, and there is no such thing as a neutral question. And yeah, and so that, we have to kind of take a position. Explicitly or implicitly, we are taking positions. So, what are those positions going to be? What are our ethical stances, right, when we're going to do the work? And but that's one of the challenges. I do run a clinic, and people come seek help for us and support. But we also know that when they leave us, they're going out into a world that you described, that the policy and the systems are built against them in various
Yes.
ways, and that's a problem. So
Well, believing that you are a political therapist is kind of at odds with like what the training is when you're coming out of school, right? I mean,
Mhm,
they kind of talk you out of bringing yourself into the therapy room, bringing your
mhm,
personality in, bringing your politics in. There's
mhm,
still kind of this model and emphasis on the blank slate, right? That you shouldn't
mhm,
be really bringing yourself into the
mhm,
room. And
mhm.
since you are a supervisor for therapists in training, I'm wondering how it is for you to counteract some of that training that those trainees may come in with to the clinic and say, well, this is what I'm learning in class. This is what I'm learning in school. How do you kind of break down that training?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's an important question. And I often tell our trainees that are coming to our places that you're going to have to do a lot of unlearning, right? And that a lot of the stuff that I mean, you know, you've been to grad school, Brittany, and I know you know this, but that a lot of our programs are just basically teaching us history of good intentions is what I call it, right? Oftentimes that created harm in people's lives, and you talked about the blank slate, this idea that was born out of psychoanalysis, but still gets propagated in programs, still has life in programs today in 2023, and isn't very useful. Even supposed blank slates are required to make interpretations and prescriptions, and those are all going to be grounded in some sort of ethical stance. So, my job, to answer your question, my job is how in the training, when we're watching video of work or we're going over transcripts, how do we help people see the intention behind the question, that there is buried in every question that you're asking your client, there is some sort of ethical stance, and you are taking a position in some way. And the more that we can make that visible for people, then they can be a little more cognizant about, what are my ethical stances, what are the positions I'm going to take in the therapy room, and how am I going to live that out in the work that I do. So
Right. I mean, I think that's important because you're going to bring stuff into the therapy room as a therapist, and you
yeah,
can try to pretend that you're going to be a blank slate, but I think that's ultimately going to be a disservice to the clients that you're attempting to
absolutely,
serve if you're not being honest with those things and grappling with those things that you are reacting to or that you're bringing into the therapy room.
absolutely, yep.
You talked about reviewing transcripts and reviewing video,
Mhm,
and some people watching this may not know what that's referring to. So I just want to clarify that, in school, typically, this isn't always the case in training, unfortunately, but therapists in training will be required to videotape themselves working with a
mhm,
client and then show it to their supervisor or to their class in graduate school and get feedback on their performance. And then same thing with the transcript. You can, type up the transcript of you working with a client and then review that in a supervision setting with your coworkers, with your
mhm.
classmates. There's a lesson from you actually that stands out in my mind where you showed your own work,
Mhm,
and it left a huge impact on me because it was about making mistakes in the therapy room
mhm,
and being able to navigate that in a very honest and vulnerable way. And I
mhm.
appreciated that you, as a supervisor, as a clinical director, showed yourself making a mistake, correcting that mistake, and have talked about that. I think you gave like a presentation about it at a conference. Is that right?
Yeah, yeah, I did. I actually keynoted the AFTA, American Family Therapy Academy conference, and I showed that video that you're speaking of. And most people go to conferences and they show their best work, right? And here's me doing this miracle intervention, and everything goes. And and I went in and I showed like my worst work, where I actually made a mistake with a client, and I showed one session, and then the following session where I actually attempted to repair that mistake with the client. And the response I got afterwards was really like, wow, you're so brave, to be on the big stage and to show your bad work and to do that. But I think it's really, really important that, for a lot of different reasons, to show that kind of work, because conventional wisdom says that, therapeutic relationships are often sometimes going to fracture in various ways and will need repair. And conventional wisdom was, if your client complains, then you don't be defensive and you do it. But I said we have to do more than that. That because we have power, there's a power operation being a therapist. Oftentimes our clients won't come to us to tell us that we did something harmful to them, or we missed the mark or made a mistake or whatever it is.
Right.
And I think it's our job to, because we're in the power seat, to know when we're making mistakes. And oftentimes we do, but we'll just brush them past. And that's my attempt to show how to do that. And I do think it's important to be a supervisor and to show people that are learning the practice and the art of therapy that your supervisor makes mistakes too. So
Yeah, and I think that's why it made such an impression on me, right?
yeah,
Because I admire you so much, and I think, as you get older, you learn, like, everyone's still just trying to figure it out, right?
yeah,
But when you're,
totally,
like,
totally,
just coming out of school, you're like, "Oh my god, there's certain therapists out here that have it all figured out. They know exactly what to do all the time." And the reality is with this work, you're always evolving, you're always growing. I mean, hopefully people are doing that in life in general, but
yeah,
especially with this work, there's going to be moments where you can't predict where things are going to go, and you're always learning something new. So
yeah.
it was nice to see that you're still going to make mistakes, but there's a way to handle it that doesn't make it feel like it's the end of the world. And
Absolutely.
I'm wondering if people that are training with you are able to easily communicate the mistakes that they make in session, knowing that you're kind of open about this, like, mistakes will be made, here's how we handle it.
Well, great point. And I think that the reason I show that video regularly, to kind of
Just wanna
hopefully set.
marinate in the mistakes you've made. You just wanna
Right.
promote it.
Yeah, I'm beating myself up, but I think it does set that state. It is important, as a supervisor, I also have to attend to power. What kind of culture am I creating in our supervision? Are people free to come and share their mistakes, or is there, everybody afraid to do that, or that kind of thing? And so it's really on me as a supervisor to kind of create a culture of just cooperation and collaboration, and that we're all in this together. We're all trying to do better by the people that seek our help. So yeah,
Yeah. Well, I've seen your table talks on YouTube. I think that's what they're called, right? Where you have the
yeah,
coffee mug?
yep, yeah.
Yeah,
I got
and
one right here.
you there we go. And you discuss brief topics in therapy, psychology,
Mm,
social justice. I think you even did a
mm.
book review on a recent
Yeah,
one.
just did a book review.
Yeah, so you're very in the know about, like, the landscape of therapy and therapists online, and I know
Yeah.
you talked about a little bit about this earlier. What are some trends that you see online that are particularly troubling you right now?
Well, I think it's the instant psychology. That's what I borrow that term from French philosopher Bruno Latour. That instant psychology that you're seeing more and more of on this super short form platforms like TikTok or Reels, where you have like 15 seconds or whatever to make some sort of point about mental health or something like that. And I interviewed on my podcast Eva Marie Swidler, who wrote a paper on the politics of curiosity, and she talked about, and I thought it was really fascinating. She talked about our capitalist culture, extractive capitalist culture, that is creating in our lives this thing that she called time poverty. That we're having to live our lives in shorter and shorter spurts of whatever, right? And you're seeing this time poverty, and she would say time poverty removes curiosity, right? And so, which curiosity is like so important to the therapeutic process, right? And so it's just removing that. And so these short form things like TikTok and Instagram or whatever requires people to kind of traffic in certainty and reduce what are nuanced and complicated um, ideas or situations or even people, reduce people down to these really diagnostic boxes, labels. I'm going to solve your problem in 4 easy steps and all of this kind of thing. And I think it's kind of really problematic, and it's draining the curiosity out of our field, and it's just problematic.
Mhm. Well,
Yeah.
I'm being reminded, since I talk a lot about politics, I'm thinking
Mm,
of, like, the most prominent political commentators as I'm listening
mm,
to you talk about that, who traffic in certainty, who traffic in, the most extreme ends of the spectrum,
mm,
and they happen to be the most popular, right? They make the
mhm,
most money, they get the most views, and so I'm wondering if it's maybe following that same kind of pattern where the people that rise to the top of therapist TikTok, let's say, are doing the same kind of thing where,
Absolutely. Yeah.
they're giving you these most simple answers possible to try to solve your problem. And there's no way they can kind of cover the nuance in the time that they have. And so, in lieu of that, they kind of just give you the most simple explanation for very complex topics and just kind of
Mhm.
have you run with that.
Yeah, and what do I want to say about that? I'm thinking, the world we live in. Most people live in a world. We live in a scary world often, and it's complex and it's chaotic, and we're on this dirt clod spinning around the sun. It's so many miles an hour, and when somebody comes along and wants to simplify it and reduce it for us, it's very, attractive. But the reality is that that's just not how the world works. The world is very complex and nuanced and complicated, and so I'm more interested in that. Like, how can we start to think again? How can we think critically? How can we think deeper? How can we play with nuance? How can we lean into uncertainty and not get captured by certainty? Those are the things I'm interested in, and those platforms that you're talking about, they don't set us up for that. They're setting us up. They're super short form, and they're just setting us up for the hot take, and pretty soon the hot take isn't going to be enough, and there'll be something down the road too. So, and I, to the therapist that might be watching, I would say, to what end? I mean, sure, your vanity metrics are probably going up, but I don't imagine you're getting a ton of business out of that. They're just getting a bunch of swipes in your 15 seconds, and is it really worth it? So.
Well, I think this is also related to some of the concerns that you initially expressed about the therapy apps that popped up,
Mhm.
especially during the pandemic. And I've long
Yeah.
been critical of the therapy apps like
Mhm.
BetterHelp, and I think Talkspace is another one of them.
Mhm.
I was primarily critical of them because I don't know that they can be an effective substitute for being in the therapy room and the work that actually happens in the therapy room.
Mhm.
I hoped that they would be effective, like during the pandemic, especially in providing access to people who otherwise were not able to seek treatment. I recently read an article in the Wall Street Journal. It was titled "The Failed Promise of Online Mental Health Treatment," and they basically describe the unethical therapist practices on the website. I mean, from people like walking around and like getting gas and being in a car with someone else during a therapy session, which I mean can happen off of BetterHelp too, but like,
Sure.
there was a discussion of lack of reasonable pay that, prompts therapists to take on too many clients on the app. They've poured millions of dollars into advertising rather than
Mhm.
fair pay or effective training for supervision or for clinical staff that they're hiring. There are many problems, as I see it, with the therapy apps. What are some of your concerns when it comes to these therapy apps?
I think primarily is, well, two things. You did mention it. I think, well, first of all, whenever extractive capitalism is involved, it's going to be problematic, right? And whenever you have venture funded mental health apps, there's always going to be a pressure to scale, a pressure to monetize, those kinds of things. So, what gets lost in that? And I would argue that the actual the stated function of the apps, to support people, that ultimately isn't the number one priority. The number one priority becomes scale and monetization, and you do that through, we've heard complaints about privacy, people's data being sold to third party vendors, lack of confidentiality. The fortunate thing, what I see happening is, I think, and it makes sense to me, is that you're starting to see MAUs, or monthly active users, dropping. Downloads of mental health apps are dropping after the spike in the pandemic, and that made sense, right? Everybody was scared; they didn't know what was going to happen. People were isolated in a particular way, and they reached out to these apps thinking that they would be helpful, and I think they found out that that's not really the case. They're not finding them that helpful, and so you're starting to see investment in these apps beginning to drop. You're starting to see mergers and acquisitions happening. Apps are being combined. And that's all a function of capitalism and the venture funded piece of it. I think the other thing, the scale thing, isn't going to work with those things. As we both know, and you just mentioned, there's not a lot of good therapists out there. So how are you going to scale it? And unfortunately, that's, sorry, you can at me whatever you want, but there are not a lot of good therapists out there, and the more you have to bring it in. So you're seeing these apps actually pivot too to move to coaching or to peer counseling or something like that, because they're realizing they can't scale it the way they need to scale, and so it's just I think it's kind of turning into a mess.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Well, I wanna touch on that comment you made. There's not a lot of good therapists out there, but before we do, we have a word from our sponsor, BetterHelp. I'm kidding. We do not have a um,
That was
so
good.
one of one of my favorite people in the field is Dr. Alan Francis,
Hmm.
a psychiatrist who helped work on the DSM-4, I believe. And he talks about therapists as good therapists are born, not made. He believes that you cannot help someone become a good therapist if they don't already have the tools necessary to be a good therapist. So you don't necessarily need to go there with your position, but for people that may be watching this and wondering, I'm looking for a therapist, or I want to eventually get to a place where I find a therapist. What are some qualities that you would recommend to someone? Like, what is a good therapist in your view?
Well, maybe I should qualify that too, and maybe this is on me, that I shouldn't blame them, right? I think it's all a function of our education programs, right? That I know certain very popular train therapy training programs where their students aren't required to show any video the whole time they're in grad school, right? And I'm a
It's
deliberate
such an
practice.
important part of it.
What's that?
It's such an important part of the training.
It's such an important part. Yeah. And, I just think that our educational systems are letting people that want to go out in the world and do good work down. So I'll
Mhm.
start with that, right? I might disagree with Alan Francis a little bit on that, but I get it. I get what he's saying.
Yeah.
Um, and what was the other?
What would be some qualities? Like if someone is looking for a therapist, what are things that you feel like are green flags, as it were, things that you would
Green flag,
recommend that
yeah.
they look for in a good therapist?
Um, that's a great question. What would I look for? Well, because I think it's all contextual, right? I mean, I'm socially located as a white cis male in Southern California. So there is a context to my social location where I might not be helpful to other people. So, whereas somebody else would, right? That maybe doesn't have my social location. So, um, but what I think, if there was something universal in all of that, I think it's about people's willingness to learn and unlearn, right? And because I think a lot of times therapy is more about good therapy is more about unlearning than learning. And a lot of the societal scripts or discourses or cultural conditioning that we've acquired over time all plays a part in the kind of work we're going to do and how effective we are in it. And I think that I would say that how willing is somebody to unlearn, and I think that would be a green flag for me.
Mhm. It kind of fits with some of the themes that I think if people are paying attention as you talk, curiosity comes up a lot. So someone who's
Mm,
maybe displaying openness, interest, a lack of rigidity in the things that you're telling them about your experience. A therapist who's explaining your experience to you is
yeah.
probably going to be a bit of a red flag situation.
Mhm.
Someone who expresses openness and wants to know more about you
Mhm.
and your situation and even what you're looking for in therapy, right? Someone who's
Yeah.
curious about maybe your past therapy experiences, what has worked in the past for you, what hasn't
Mm.
worked in the past for you, so that they can really understand what you need in that
Right.
moment. I think those would be good things.
Yeah, you made me think. So if your therapist has a large following on TikTok, probably should get another therapist.
Okay, that's a good one. Very, very good. So we've talked a little bit about what are some problems and trends that concern you in the field of psychology right now with therapy. What are things that you want to see become trendy? Like what do you want to see therapists getting really excited about and investing their time in and really going after? What do you want to see become trendy?
Uh, well, I've become interested in. I want to. How do we do help people do uncertainty? That's what I'm really interested in, right? And that often things that. So I'm very interested in often things that get characterized as self-sabotage. Some of your listeners may have been accused of self-sabotage or addiction relapse or something like that. I've always kind of believed that that is just a turning back to what Michael White would say is a known and familiar way that people enter into trying to change their lives, but often the uncertainty gets to be too much, and then they go back to what is known and familiar, and we can't blame them. So I become interested in how do we help people um, play with the future a little bit, lean into liminal space, do uncertainty, and that requires conversations around the future. And I don't think we've become very good at critiquing our present. We're not very. I think we're losing our skill about how to talk about composing a future. So that's what I'm interested in right now.
And what do you mean by composing a future? Is that like goal setting in terms of like therapy speak, I guess?
Not goals specifically, but what are the possible? I think Alan Phillips, who's a psychoanalyst in England, he wrote a book I liked, and he said in it, that most people come to therapy with like worst case scenarios. So I become in like there's a predictive framework called future scenarios where you play with potential scenarios and how those multiple possibilities of how the future might look, and how do we help people act in the face of uncertainty? So because people are going to come to therapy with worst case scenarios anyway,
Mhm.
how do we populate them with other kinds of scenarios that might be possible? So
How has it been helpful for you to learn to be comfortable with uncertainty?
that's a great question. So, I was thinking about that the other day, that this is something I want to talk about, but am I any good at it, right, in my own life? And so, I think I have been. I've taken some big pivots in my life, career changes, those kinds of things. So I do have some knowledge of what that requires, and how scary it can be. So hopefully, I can bring some of that experience to bear in this work. I'm currently writing a paper about it. Hopefully, something that can get published here soon.
Oh, nice. Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
I also saw in your bio that you're going to be the co-editor of the forthcoming Encyclopedia of Radical Helping, that
Yes.
should be released by Thick Press in 2024. What is the Encyclopedia of Radical Helping? It sounds
Thank
cool.
you. Thank you for asking. Yeah. So I did a little emerging book project 2 years ago now with Thick Press. And it was titled Beyond Critique, Composition, and Therapy, basically. Some of the ideas I was just talking about. But then we began to have some conversations with Julie and Aaron at Thick Press. And they came to me and they said, we want to put together this encyclopedia of radical helping. They do a lot of publishing of various help, models of care, basically helping models from mutual aid to all kinds of stuff. And they came to me with this idea of Encyclopedia of Radical Helping, and would I want to be a co-editor of that. And I just got really excited about this project because there's nothing out there like it. Like, what are all of these kinds of different models of care that stand out of traditional medical model psychology, right? And there's a bunch, and there's a lot of people doing innovative and fascinating things out there, and we're going to try to pull them all together and in one location, and that should be published next year, 2024.
Wow, that's really cool. So is it going to be like people kind of writing how they do these other types of
Yes.
radical
Yeah.
helping?
Yeah. We have all kinds of contributors that are doing all kinds of, radical helping out there in the communities. And actually, we got contributors from all over the world, which is really neat. And it's going to be a wonderful publication.
That's awesome. I imagine it's going to focus on things similar to what we were talking about in terms of effective policy and their lack of attention on certain issues and maybe things like harm reduction. Is that going to be
Absolutely. Yep. Harm reduction. Yeah. All kinds of, yeah, exactly.
okay?
All of the things.
Well, maybe we'll have to have you back again when that is
Please.
published to talk about some of
Please.
those things.
Yeah.
Um, so, One thing that we like to do on I Doubt It podcast when we have a
Mhm.
guest on is we end every talk with them by asking them a question. And the point of this question is to emphasize the importance of changing one's mind when the evidence changes or when our understanding of evidence changes, and practicing flexibility and uncertainty, right? Our lack of
Yep.
really knowing what's going on and how we have to be comfortable with change. So, on that topic, I
Mhm.
want to ask you, Dr. Chris Hoff, what is the last thing that you changed your mind about?
Yeah, I love this, and I think and I love your intention behind it. And if I were gonna, can I share something that's in process of changing?
Yes, absolutely. We
Okay.
love to get into the process.
Okay. So uh, I've always been fairly, just for listeners, I've always been fairly skeptical and cynical of the somatic therapy movement, right? And so
Tell
I
us what
felt,
somatic therapy is, just for
yeah,
people.
so some of the approaches like somatic experience, it's about therapy of the body, right? There's been a book like The Body Keeps the Score that I'm sure a lot of your listeners are familiar with, or Peter Levine's work in somatic experiencing, or EMDR. I'm sure many of your listeners probably have experienced, some of those modalities. And quite honestly, and people that are trained with me or know that I've been kind of skeptical and cynical of all that stuff. I thought there was a lot of snake oil and stuff and all of that, and and especially when people are ascribing to the brain things that the neuroscientists are always frustrated with the psychologists, because they'll take these psychologists, ask any neuroscientist, right? Psychologists will take emerging ideas and call them truths. And I even interviewed Dina Weisberg, who's a Ivy League cognitive psychologist, and she did a study where she showed that you could show anybody a brain scan and get them to believe anything, and so, and there's people out there doing that, right? And
I think Dr. Daniel Amen comes to mind.
I was not going to name any names, but okay.
That's
So
what we do here.
okay, I like it. You did it. Okay. Yeah, so I was very skeptical of that stuff, but I've become, and then there's a lot of money you have to spend in workshops just to be able to send somebody to a yoga class or mindfulness exercises, or just to be able to ask somebody where they feel that in their body, and it just kind of stops there. So I was kind of skeptical of all that stuff, but what I'm changing my mind about is that there is wisdom of the body. There is a bodily knowing that I think we all have. And I'm become interested in how do we articulate that knowing and help our clients in that way. So, I'm beginning to change my mind. Beginning to wade in a little bit about changing my mind about the role the body has in therapy, and in the midst of all the noise and confusion and misinformation. But I do think in the midst of that, there is some way that we can help folks articulate what might be going on in their bodies to their benefit. So I've been thinking about that. That's where I'm kind of changing my mind a little bit.
All right. So there's some uncertainty there that I'm hearing.
Yes, yes, for sure.
Acknowledging a little bit of lack of knowledge, maybe, and
Yes. Yep.
really getting comfortable with that.
Yep. Yep.
Okay.
Exactly.
What's motivating the change, by the way? Did you read something or come across something that kind of struck you and had you question some of your underlying beliefs?
Well, no, I just, whenever I shut myself off to something completely, I think that's a warning sign to maybe I might be missing something. And so, um, I mean, I'm still critical of some of that stuff, don't get me wrong, but I think I'm looking for other voices that have interesting things to say about the body. And I think maybe from this project that we're talking about, the Encyclopedia of Radical Helping, and some of the entries that people are providing in that have me thinking along different ways about how we might be able to do that. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, and I think also the work that, we do in therapy can lead us to that place, right? Especially if we
Sure.
encounter someone who maybe is not able to work with the theoretical orientation that we have been trained to use or that we
Hmm.
prefer to practice with, those kinds of things can cause those moments of growth too. So I
Hmm.
think, I'm so happy that you came on today because I want the audience to go and subscribe to you. And are you on
Very well.
TikTok? I think you need to be on
No,
TikTok.
no, I'm not on TikTok.
Okay, well, I'm on TikTok, so it's
Okay,
fine.
sorry.
Follow me on TikTok. I don't do therapy recommendation videos, though. I'm not doing that. But I just think you are such an important person to have in a helping profession because you care about people. You care about these, important values that you've been talking
Yeah.
about with uncertainty, with continuing education, with seeing things from other people's perspectives, and always trying to be better. And I think that we need more of that. We need more of that in every field. So thank you for coming on to talk to me today. I very much appreciate it. And I would recommend everyone go and check you out. Where can they find you?
Yeah, thanks, Brittany. I want to say also thank you, Brittany. I love the work that you're doing, and I'm, just excited to see all the stuff you're doing. So,
Thank you.
and thank you for the invitation. Anybody wants to find me, you can find me at the Radical Therapist on Instagram, the Radical Therapist on Facebook, and Dr. Chris Hoff on Instagram, or just shoot me an email, chrishoffmft@gmail.com.
Perfect. They can yell at you
They
directly.
can they can yell at me directly. Yeah, yeah.
All right. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being here. I appreciate you.
Thank you, Brittany. Appreciate it.